I should start out by saying that this sermon is kind of one that got out of control when I was writing it. I probably wrote about 5 of them when I realized that I was halfway through and I was already at the 11th page. A lot of it went to the cutting room floor, and it doesn't really resemble a whole lot the sermon I started to write in the first place. And even this is a little bit long, but bear with me. From childhood, I always had the feeling that I was kind of a stranger in a strange land. I was living among, but not quite part of the human species. I don't know if any of you have had that feeling, but for many years, I thought this feeling of alienness was hereditary. After all, I did have a cousin named Blanche who believed to the core of her bone that she was brought here from Venus by flying saucers and left to live among us. Then in my 18th year on this confusing planet, I discovered Star Trek, and of course, that wonderfully logical character of Mr. Spock. For those of you that missed the series, which after all, it did air half a century ago, the question of what made people human was a frequent theme. Often it would revolve around logical Mr. Spock and passionate Dr. McCoy. Other times, you would see humanity viewed through the eyes of various alien species, alternative universes, or even one time they split Captain Kirk in half. But regardless of the theatrical device employed, the message was always the same. Humans are complex beings who are simultaneously savages and saints, but had the power to choose which they wanted to be. Now, about that time, it also occurred to me that if a television show was asking questions like this, perhaps I was not the only one having problems figuring out what it exactly meant to be a human being. In fact, I looked at the shelves in the bookstores, they had bookstores back then, and pages in phone books, they had phone books back then, and the bookstores were full of self-help books, and the phone books were full of entries for therapists. So I came to realize that I wasn't the only one having a problem. It seems that everybody wanted some guidance to help them understand their humanity. Now, at that time, religion really was not much of a help to me. As a 12-year-old child, I was nearly ejected from catechism class for questioning the doctrine of original sin. After all, what 12-year-old boy wants to be responsible for something that, if it did happen, happened millennia before in prehistory? It's bad enough that the church insisted that I had to be my brother's keeper. But why must I also suffer for something that someone named Adam did long ago before the dawn of history? It seemed to me to be inherently unfair. I wasn't even old enough to start shaving, and already I found myself condemned to eternal damnation over an apple. Rejecting the religious view of human nature, I turned to science, and more specifically Darwin's theory of evolution. The bottom line, which infuriates many Christians to this day, is that we were not formed in the image of God to have dominion over nature, but are instead an integral part of nature, formed by evolution in the image of a monkey. When I first studied evolution in high school biology class, scientists had narrowed our monkey ancestor down to one of the grape ape families. But which of the great apes? I'm glad they had left that open when I was studying biology. Because there's some members of the ape family I wouldn't mind admitting I was part of their family tree. The giant gorilla, for example, going to the zoo, looking into those piercing eyes. Yeah, I could be his cousin. Or even the orangutan that's so athletic and swung from tree to tree and so impressive. I could be the descendant of an orangutan. But then we discovered DNA and ruined it all. Because we are not descended from noble gorillas or athletic orangutans. No, we are the ancestors of the clown prince of apes, Bonzo the chimp. We are all ancestors of the stupid-looking chimpanzees. I felt like someone who wanted to disown a disreputable resident of my family tree. This actually gave me a lot better insight into how creationists feel. But regardless of what we think about chimpanzees, to understand what it means to be human, we must start with the nature of Bonzo the chimp. Before going further, let's look at this embarrassment of the human family tree. To begin with, we should share DNA with not one, but two types of chimpanzees. The common chimpanzee, which I find interesting, is known as the pan troglodyte, and the bonobo, which I'd never heard of before. While both chimps look similar, they have very different behaviors. The common chimpanzee, which is the one we studied the most, is an omnivore living in hunting communities organized around and dominated by an alpha male. It is more aggressive than the bonobo and, like most mammals, only has sex when conception is likely. Common chimpanzees also engage in that most human of activities, war. In 1974, Dr. Jane Goodall observed a 4-year-old territorial war between two tribes of gorillas, or chimpanzees rather, that ended with one group completely annihilating the other group. Now, the bonobo, on the other hand, the bonobos are largely vegetarian, have a matriarchal egalitarian society, are largely nonviolent, and, like us, have sex anytime for a variety of reasons, including, interestingly, the peaceful resolution of conflicts. Now, I will leave it to you to decide which type of chimpanzee you have the most DNA from. More importantly, however, these chimpanzee types share some things in common, and that's what I want to talk about. Both types of chimpanzees live in social structures between 40 and 120 people. If the group gets larger than they are comfortable with, then the group either splits into two separate groups or internal conflict drives enough members away to get the group down to the size that the rest of them are comfortable with. As anyone who's ever participated in a UU-sponsored church growth workshop knows, this limit on the size of groups we can bond with has been passed down to modern humans, even to highly evolved humans like Unitarians. As the troglodyte and bonobo chimps evolved into early hominids and later into Homo sapiens, us, we retained the chimps' emotions and hormones and emotions. We retained the chimps' suspicion of strangers outside their small group and their violent response to being threatened. We retained their territoriality and a lot of other characteristics that lurk deep in our inner brain. Fortunately for us, we are not only programmed and driven by these chimpanzee instincts, but our brain is coded, and I was amazed, the cerebral cortex is only about the thickness of a stack of about 3 dimes, and it coats the rest of the brain. But yet the cerebral cortex, also known as gray matter, is the part of the brain that controls reason and language. It's the logical part. It's the Spock in us. Because of that, we can self-program ourselves. We can use language to create collective memory, pass our knowledge on from one generation to the next, and organize ourselves ever more efficiently to perform ever more complicated tasks. So in essence, Star Trek was right. We are complex human beings that are simultaneously savages and saints, but with the power to choose which we want to be. Or, to put it in evolutionary terms, we are cursed to fight an internal conflict between the programming we create for ourselves and the emotions and instinctive reactions we inherited from troglodyte and bonobo chimpanzees. Oh, lucky us. Now, until about 10,000 years ago, this really wasn't a problem for human beings. Early humans did not have to worry much about fighting their inner chimpanzee, because after all, the first hominoids were nomadic tribes of hunter-gatherers, much like the chimps from which they descended. Their behaviors were driven by the emotions and instincts of our ape ancestors, and these emotions and instincts ensured the survival and success of early humans, just like they ensured the survival and success of chimpanzees. But then we went and did something we probably shouldn't. The hunters learned how to domesticate animals, and the gatherers learned how to cultivate plants. Good or bad, these discoveries changed us as a species forever. In fact, I would argue we became a different species and separated us from all the other creatures on the planet. Once we learned how to produce our own food, human tribes could stay in one place, build huts, grow food, breed plants and animals. Survival no longer required people to devote every waking hour chasing wild animals or searching through the woods for edible plants. Instead, that extra time could be used to organize, invent, create, and yes, write sermons. Thus was born civilization, a concept still regarded by many in our time as a bad move. Once we abandoned the small bands of hunter-gatherers and created the great cities of the early civilizations, the emotions and instincts of our chimp ancestors no longer assured our survival and success. Agriculture introduced economies of scale into the human equation. The organizational structure of small groups that worked for millions of years was no longer viable. Small groups needed to work together with other small groups, and these large groups then needed to work with other large groups. Once we realized through the domestication of animals that sex was a part of the reproductive process, which is kind of an interesting story I learned in college, the territorial nature we inherited from our chimps kicked in and led to the creation of the family structure and monogamous relationships. Yeah, these nomads actually wandered into a city one day and let people know how babies were formed, and that really had an effect in the ancient world. In a sense, through the domestication of animals and the cultivation of plants, Homo sapiens is, in effect, if not by name, an entirely new species, one that controls its environment rather than reacts to it, and uses learning and self-programming to create new and different behavioral responses to our emotional and instinctual inputs from the chimp within. In other words, we had to evolve faster than Darwin's theory of selective adaptation would allow. So we just started reprogramming ourselves and got farther and farther away from who we originally were created by evolution to be. So no wonder, as a child, I never felt like I belonged here on this planet. In some fundamental way, I don't. Rather, we all have been part of a 10,000-year experiment to determine whether Homo sapiens can knit together tens, hundreds, thousands, millions, and someday perhaps a billion of these small groups of 40 to 120 people into one interdependent web. So, how is it today an electronics engineer in Simi Valley, California, can coordinate her designs with a production engineer in Taiwan, who then calls a factory manager in China, who then works with suppliers from Japan, South Korea, and Mexico to bring together components to manufacture an iPhone that someone here today may be picking up at the Verizon store to give as a gift for Christmas? Especially since each one of these people involved have an inner brain telling them not to trust anyone outside their own small group. This miracle is so awesome and improbable that we, like other great miracles, like life itself, is so overwhelming that we take it for granted. And because we take it for granted, we fail to appreciate the overwhelming number of ties and bonds that have been created over 10,000 years to make it all possible. We are separated from our animal nature and linked together in a myriad of ways. Each is a specialized field of study in the modern world. And I'm not going to be able to get into all of them because as I got into researching this sermon, there are literally thousands, if not millions, of these various kinds of ties. But the ties that bind us fall into three categories. There's the internal programming that we use to override our instincts and allow us to move beyond small groups. The interrelational ties that tie all these individuals and small groups with one another and bind them. And then there are the external institutions that provide the structure to keep all of us chimps from jumping the rails. As I better understand myself and my ongoing struggle to modify my inner nature to be acceptable in the civilized world I was born into, I have reassessed much of my views on religion that I formed over half a century ago. In reality, religion is the cornerstone of our effort to reprogram ourselves, the rock on which the rest of our society is built. It is, Its original purpose, I think, if you look back far enough, was to guide our self-programming and define the bonds that tie us together in thousands, then millions, then billions of human beings who, by their very nature, don't want to be bound together. Now, whether we like it or not, for most of us, our programming at its core is religious. And even more frustrating for Unitarian Universalists, most of this programming for us comes out of our Judeo-Christian tradition. Even says so on the back of the order service. Other cultures have different programming generated by other religious beliefs, but it is amazing how similar they have all become to one another. But in our culture, we have to start with the primary programming that comes out of the first and most widely printed book in the world, the Bible. Now, I can even sense your discomfort at that statement from this pulpit, so let me explain a little bit about what I've come to learn over the years about the Bible. It is not what we think it is, and it is not what we've been told it is. It is actually a chronicle or a history book, not an accurate history of people and events the way we think of history, but rather a chronicle of the most eventful period of human existence. The time when we covered our 8 bodies with clothes, moved into the cities, discovered the true meaning of sex, began to produce our own food, and alter the very structure of the world we live in. Some of the stories, for example, Noah and the Great Flood, are part of an oral tradition that goes back before the invention of writing and is told in practically every religion in the world. So if you can get over your experiences like I had in Bible school and do what I did, which Janet's insistence was to take 8 years of Bible study and look at the Bible in this way, it can be a fascinating journey. For this reason alone, I think religious liberals should not ignore the Bible. The oldest stories in the Bible are found in the appropriately named Old Testament, and most specifically in the first book, Genesis. Found here is the most fundamental programming that humans in our culture used in forming the institutions and the ideas that reprogrammed our cerebral cortex. And it can be embodied in one set of missives out of the Old Testament, the 10 Commandments. And as summarized in the very, very unscholarly source that I used, Wikipedia, it says, the 10 Commandments concern matters of fundamental importance to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The greatest obligation to worship only God. The greatest injury to commerce and law, bearing false witness. The greatest intergenerational obligation, honor to parents. The greatest obligation to community, truthfulness. The greatest threat to community, envy. And the greatest injury to movable property, theft. In other words, the 10 Commandments, whether you think they came from God or the imagination of a very creative Moses, laid the foundation for the creation of a system of ties and bonds and relationships that allowed us to transcend our animal nature, which is probably why Moses was so upset with the golden calf. These basic ideas, which are found not only in the so-called religions of the book, but in religious and ethical teachings around the world, are the foundation for the internal and external ties and bonds we create to unite the individual to the group and the group to ever larger groups. Internally, we use the cerebral cortex to override our instincts with concepts like honor, duty, responsibility, promises, truth, virtue, and self-sacrifice. These override our hardwired instincts for self-gratification and greed, for territoriality, and for suspicion of large groups. And we also override our fear groups in which we are not part of and cannot see by focusing our allegiance beyond the group, away from the tribe, toward something far beyond us. Once we achieve these changes in ourselves, we have interpersonal ties like covenants and contracts, vows and commitments. Ideally, these are honored voluntarily, and to our credit as chimpanzees, we largely do honor these things voluntarily. But when there is a failure in those covenants and promises and vows and bonds, we have external controls that have been set up. Things like nasty little things like laws and contracts, rewards and punishment, peer pressure and social norms, and, heaven forbid, governments and regulation, all to keep our inner chimp under control. And diligently, throughout time and across the planet, mothers tell their children stories, like the one I read, Toodle, to reinforce this programming, thus strengthening the bonds that tie an individual to the group and the groups to one another. At the same time, and this is largely where Unitarians and Universalists have come in, we have modified this system to evolve, to allow novel new ties to be created and outmoded or less efficient ones to fade away. Religious and secular prophets have emerged to challenge the established order and scold us about our deviation from what we have been taught is right and true. Over time, the system of ties and bonds that underpin our civilization has changed. Ties that no longer serve are deleted, and new ties that are more relevant to the changing world around us are added. In essence, we not only self-program ourselves, we also evolve as a species faster than natural selection allows. As Charles Darwin so eloquently put it, it is not the strongest of the species that survives, not the most intelligent that survives. It is the one that is most adaptable to change. As long as the self-programming that alters the chimpanzee programming evolution left us with holds, and the ties that bind us remain strong, we can adapt. But is this system still holding? In visualizing the elaborate system of internal and external ties and bonds that unite the various tribes that make up our nation, my engineering training and background inevitably took me back to mechanical engineering, and I started to envision a bridge. Not any bridge, but a very specific one. The one in Minneapolis, Minnesota, that once guided vehicles on Interstate 35 over the Mississippi River. The load of the traffic, much like the strain to keep our animal nature in check, was distributed across thousands of parts, held together by even more thousands of welds and bolts. But the pounding of the traffic and the inevitable toll of the elements, like the passions and instincts of our ancestors inside us, rusted the bolts and stressed the welds. As long as rusted bolts are replaced and weak welds are repaired, the bridge continues to bear the weight of the traffic. Even the loss of one bolt or weld would not cause the bridge to fail, because, like any good design, the bridge has built-in redundancies. But at some point, if too many bolts or welds fail and are not repaired or replaced, the shifted strains goes to the other joints and the weaker joints fail, which would then shift more of the load onto the remaining bolts and welds, which would then break loose until, on the evening of August 1st, 2007, the bridge did collapse, killing 13 people. I sense today that the system that we've built up of internal restraints, social contracts, and institutions of external enforcement that has allowed our species to evolve and prosper in the new reality that was created 10,000 years ago are, like the bridge in Minneapolis, getting very, very old. I don't know if you feel the same way, But I have a sense that these bonds and these ties that once tied this nation together and this nation with the countries of the rest of the world are beginning to fail. Today, we watch as England leaves the European Union. Wonder to one another as one of our largest banks is found guilty of defrauding thousands of customers by creating millions of false accounts and then using their money without letting them know. And finally, we are in the process of enduring a presidential campaign in which both candidates, at the moment, are disliked by a majority of citizens, and at least one of the candidates appears to have no control whatsoever over his inner chimp. So, ironically, just as the ties that bind us together reached around the world, and even at one point all the way to the moon, we are beginning to see it all start to reverse, and perhaps it may soon collapse. When the dust settles from this election, which is another sermon that got tossed to the floor, perhaps what I think is maybe the last battle, or the most decisive battle, in what some call the cultural war, there is another more pressing challenge on the horizon. For all of the changes we have made in the system to have any permanence and meaning through the culture wars, through everything that Unitarians and Universalists have been about, the ties that bind us together as a world community now need to be repaired before the entire system collapses. The challenge, I think, for liberal religion in the rest of the 21st century may be to rebuild the ties that will bind an expected 10 billion people of the year 2050 together in a way that ensures our species' survival while preserving and enhancing each individual's inherent worth and dignity. The journey begins with understanding ourselves better. It continues with understanding and, when appropriate, forgiving others who are different from ourselves. And it ends, ultimately, with a world that we would really like our children to inherit with us. Now, if this isn't a project tailor-made for Unitarian Universalists, I don't know what is.